Okay. Well, last week we finished, this is just the second and third, the second and third pages of the notes. I have some extra copies from last week if you wanted the first page of the notes. If you don't have those, or maybe if you've lost them or something like that. So if you want the whole collection, just see me after church, okay? I know that you'll be selling this on eBay at some point. I'm just kidding. All right, so we turned our attention to a consideration of the biblical doctrine of demons. We looked at their names, some of the ways that the Bible designates these entities, these fallen angels. Last week we ended with a brief consideration of their nature. So they are, of course, evil. They are creatures, as Colossians chapter 1, verse 16 says. They are made through Christ. God made them through His Son, the image of God. And they are intelligent, remarkably so, I would say. They are very powerful, but they are subservient to Christ. And you'll remember I put we could put other examples there, but I gave you a couple of instances from the life of Christ. In particular, the Gerasene or the Gadarene demoniac, the man who had the legion of demons. And you'll remember how terrified they are when they are confronted with Christ. And they ask, when you compare Luke's account with Matthew's account, even bringing in Mark's account of this story, it's recorded in all three of the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You remember they're terrified, and so they ask, are you here to torment us before the time? So they recognize that there will be a time of judgment, that time is not now, and they're wondering if Jesus is going to cast them into the abyss. That's what they say. Are you going to cast us into the abyss? Are you going to cast us into hell before the time? Are you going to judge us? Is this the end of us? Now, this sets up what we're going to consider next, because I think that there is a reason why these demons who are inhabiting this man and tormenting him ask that specific question. I mean, think about it. Why would they be concerned about being tormented or cast into hell, the abyss, before the day of judgment? Well, I would argue that such a thing has happened to certain fallen angels, that the Bible reveals that there was a rebellion that was so heinous that God decided not to allow these demons to continue roaming this earth with some measure of free reign, but rather they were cast at that point into hell. Now you remember Jesus says in Matthew chapter 25 verse 41, speaking of the sheep and the goats and how on the day of judgment the Son of Man will separate the sheep from the goats, and the goats, he says, will be cast into the lake of fire which was prepared. Does anybody remember what it says? Prepared for the devil and his angels. So hell, it would seem, was not originally created as the destiny of humans, but rather as the destiny of Satan and his fallen host, okay? So that then brings us to the next section. You can find it on the back of the page there. The fall, or rather it's actually on the front page. It starts on the front page, Their fall. If you remember, a couple weeks ago, we looked at Revelation chapter 12. If you'd like to go ahead and turn there with me, you can. We're going to be spending a lot of time tonight in Genesis. So if you want to go ahead and put your finger there at the beginning of the Bible and then flip over to the end of the Bible, Revelation chapter 12, you remember we have this vision that John receives on the Isle of Patmos. Verse 1 of chapter 12, a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and on her head were a crown of 12 stars. So the 12 stars, very significant, signifies the 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 apostles. So this woman is not Mary. She's going to be giving birth to a son. She is giving birth to a son when we find her in Revelation 12. But she represents the people of God. from whom, out of whom, comes the Messiah. So verse 2, she was with child. She cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. And then we find in verse 3 that another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 crowns, 7 diadems, which would signify, of course, this is Satan, but wearing crowns, we've talked about that a lot so far, signifying, of course, some measure of authority in the fallen world. Well, verse 4 says, his tail swept away a third of the stars of heaven and threw them down to earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour her child. So this is that cosmic conflict that we read about in Genesis 3:15. The seed of the woman is being born, is coming into the world, and the serpent, in this case the dragon, is seeking to destroy him, is seeking to inflict a mortal wound. And we find out that he will inflict a wound that will appear to be mortal. That's clear. He will strike you on your heel. Genesis 3 says, but in the process, he will be exposing himself and will be finally defeated because his head will be crushed, all right? So Satan is waiting to devour this child, but notice what it says again in verse 4, that his tail in this vision sweeps a third of the stars out of the sky. Well, a number of interpreters, and I am in agreement with them, would say that this is a reference to all of the angels who followed Satan in his rebellion. Regardless of when that took place, regardless of if they all fell at the same time, the Bible nowhere indicates that they all fell at the same time. In fact, I'm going to be making a case starting tonight that we have an account in Genesis of an angelic fall that would have happened after even the fall of humanity. Okay, so more on that later. But this could be, it's not the only option. There are other options. Some interpreters would take the stars in heaven to be a reference to the people of God, and so they are cast down to earth, meaning that they are persecuted by Satan. But given the fact that in the Old Testament we have angels being referred to as stars, it would seem that it's a very natural conclusion to understand chapter 12, verse 4, Revelation chapter 12, verse 4, as a reference to how many angels followed Lucifer into his rebellion. And so it may be the case here that we have something of a general statement about the fact that a third of the angels followed him, as I said, into his rebellion against God. Okay? Any questions before we move on? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
Now, there's got to be at some point that how did the devil disguise himself? How did he get that big of a tail head? It's a metaphor, okay?
Yeah, definitely a vision, metaphor.
Okay.
Yeah. And it's evoking with this language of the dragon, it is evoking most certainly the what we find in Genesis 3 of the serpent. So yeah, most certainly. And as you were mentioning, 2 Corinthians does, Paul does, we mentioned this at some point in our study, but he can and often does masquerade as an angel of light, right? He appears to be good, and in so doing can lead people astray, okay? All right. Well, let's see here. Okay. So now we come to Genesis chapter 6. I have been telling you that we would eventually get here. When we were in the book of Jude on Sunday mornings, I told people because we didn't really camp out there in Jude verse 6, when Jude refers to these angels, rather enigmatically, these angels who sinned, being kept in eternal bonds. And I said, if you want to know more on that, we are fast approaching that topic in our Wednesday night study. And so now we have arrived. I don't think that we are going to finish this Tonight, I'm going to be gone the next 2 Wednesday nights. I'm taking some vacation time. So, Lord willing, when I return, we'll pick it up. But I want to try to get as much done in the next 15 to 20 minutes as we can. So turn with me to Genesis chapter 6. Genesis chapter 6, and let's read the first 4 verses. This is a text that is often brought up, especially in conversations like this and studies like this, and so we do need to deal with it. Genesis chapter 6, verse 1, now it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves whomever they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. And then after that, we go into verse 5, that the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And so this is the start of the flood narrative. Genesis 6 is integrally, inextricably connected with the flood story. Whatever it is that Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is talking about, it is connected with the flood story, and it is connected to this claim that we find in verse 5 that wickedness is just running rampant throughout the world. So let me just say, by way of introduction to this, it is okay if you do not take the view that I take, all right? Godly, Bible-believing Christians have come down on different sides of this debate. That's fine. The view that I'm going to defend here in this study is one that I've come to after a lot of study, a lot of thought, a lot of time with this. I think it's the best explanation of these verses. I think it's just the best way in total as a whole of understanding the text and what it's saying, as well as understanding what Jude and 2 Peter are talking about. But I very well could be wrong, okay? And I admit, the view that I take, it's an old view, it's an ancient view, it's an ancient Jewish view. It is a little strange, okay, kind of off the beaten path. And for those of you who care, this is not John Calvin's view, the one that I take, all right? I'll let you know what John Calvin's view is. So yes, I'm disagreeing with the great reformer who pretty much ridiculed the view that I think is actually the correct one. Because again, it's a rather strange thing. If it actually did take place, like I think it did, if these verses actually do mean this, it's a pretty strange occurrence. But again, if we believe that God can make the world out of nothing, simply call it into being, if we think that Balaam had a donkey that spoke with him, as Scripture says, if we think that a dead man came back to life never to die again, well, I mean, we live in a supernatural world, and so strange things can most certainly happen. Well, let me give you the main views, the main interpretations that are on offer. The first one, we can call it the Sethite view, or the Sethite interpretation. And what this is, basically, is this. We have to identify who these sons of God are that are spoken of in Genesis 6, verse 2, and who the daughters of men are that are spoken of in that very same verse. So the sons of God, according to this understanding, we're going to go into the text a little bit and try to flesh this out, are members of the godly line of Seth, Adam and Eve's third child, third son, who intermarry with the ungodly line of Cain. And because of that, there is great wickedness that is introduced into the human race, which then sort of snowballs until we get to the flood. So once again, the sons of God, according to this view, are the godly members of the lineage of Seth, who are then intermarrying with these ungodly women from the line of Cain. And of course, God told Israel this, God tells Christians this, that if you marry, you're supposed to marry, Paul says, you marry in the Lord, right? You marry a fellow Christian. If you were in ancient Israel, you married a fellow Israelite or a Gentile who had joined themselves to Israel, in the case of Ruth, for example. So this then would have been an intermarriage between those who knew the Lord and those who did not, and so it introduces a great deal of wickedness according to this view. So why is it that people hold this? This is Calvin's view, by the way. This is John Calvin's view. So if you go back to Genesis chapter 4, Genesis chapter 4 contains the story of the murder of Abel by his brother Cain, and then we get a genealogy. If you look at verse 16, Cain went out from the presence of the Lord, settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Cain had relations with his wife. She conceived, gave birth to Enoch, and etc. And so we get something of a lineage here that would be Cain's offspring. And you come all the way down to verse 23. Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, listen to my voice, you wives of Lamech, give heed to my speech, for I have killed a man for wounding me and a boy for striking me. If Cain is avenged sevenfold, then Lamech 77-fold. So it is true, when we look at Genesis 4, that it doesn't look very promising for the line of Cain, because it comes to a head here in verses 23 and 24 with this man named Lamech, who responds, tells his wife, listen, I killed someone for wounding me, which we might say is a bit of an overreaction, right? He's bragging, he's boasting about this. Okay, someone wounded me and I just killed him. And then he says, it's okay, it's fine. I mean, he recognizes that some people might have an issue with this, which leads us to understand most likely not self-defense. Something has happened, he has decided to overreact and kill someone who has done something to him. It's not eye for eye, it's not tooth for tooth, anything like that. He recognizes people may have a problem, people may call this murder. But he says, listen, if Cain can murder Abel and get off the hook, well then so can I. If God's going to avenge anyone who lays a hand on Cain, well, God's going to avenge anyone who lays a hand on me for what I have done. So again, can we call the line of Cain pretty ungodly? Absolutely. Doesn't look very promising for the family of Cain. Well, in verse 25, Adam had relations with his wife again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth. Named him Seth, for she said, God has appointed me another offspring in place of Abel because Cain killed him. That word offspring is the word seed, the Hebrew noun zerah. So Genesis 3:15, there's going to be a seed of the woman who crushes the serpent and who basically solves this whole problem. We were talking about this in Sunday school on Sunday morning. Well, again, Eve is apparently clinging to this promise. She has Cain and she says, oh, God has given me a son. Most likely thinking to herself, this is the one, this is my seed, this is my first offspring, God's going to do wonders with him. Well, he ends up becoming a murderer. She also thought of Abel as a seed because she says God has appointed Seth to replace Abel, but Abel's dead. Abel's dead, Adam and Eve are still outside of the garden, still outside of paradise. So she has a third son, and she says, here's the seed. Here he is. Well, as we all know, he of course isn't the promised seed. And so in chapter 5, verse 1, this is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day when God created man, he made him, in the likeness of God. He created them male and female, and he blessed them and named them man. Literally, he named them Adam. So Adam is not just the name of a single individual human, but it's the name of the entire race, man or humanity. So he named them man in the day when they were created. And then we get a genealogy of Seth. We get his genealogy now. So there is, granted, a clear contrast being drawn from the end of chapter 4 into chapter 5 a clear contrast between the line of Cain and the line of Seth. And things do look a little more promising for the line of Seth. So far, I'm in agreement that there is a contrast between these two lineages that come from Adam. One that not a lot of hope for, one is looking a little bit more promising. However, how do we know that Seth isn't the one who's going to crush the head of the serpent? Well, if you read chapter 5, you're going to see a refrain that is repeated over and over and over and over again. Anybody want to take a guess as to what that refrain is? If you read chapter 5, it's like it's repetitive. And he died. Okay? And he died. Why is that significant? Why does the author of Genesis keep repeating that? Because he wants to tell us death is still around. The curse is still around. We're not yet back in the garden. It's not going to be Seth who solves this problem. But interestingly enough, we do get to verse 24 and we find that Enoch walked with God and he was not, for God took him. So here is a break in the refrain. And he died, and he died, and he died, and he was not because God took him, and he died, and he died, and he died. So right in the middle of all this death, we have God taking a man to heaven who doesn't die as an act of pure grace. And so I think we're reminded in the midst of all these reminders of judgment, hey, salvation is coming. Death is going to be taken care of. Kind of a preview of coming attractions in the life of Enoch. All right. So then when we come to chapter 6, the claim then is made, sons of God, daughters of men, it must be these two lines, these two lineages, one from Seth, one from Cain. However, there is something that we also need to take note of. Nowhere in chapter 6 is that point made explicitly. Nowhere does the author say, by the way, sons of God, that's Seth's lineage. They're not perfect, are they? Of course not. They're still sinners. They're still dying. And he doesn't say the daughters of men. Well, that's the line of Cain. Daughters of men is just literally daughters of human beings. So sons of God and then female humans. We could put it that way. So I find myself to be, at the end, a little bit unconvinced that this is the right view. Now, there's one other piece here that I forgot to point out to you. Go back to chapter 4, verse 26. To Seth, to him also was born a son, and he called his name Enosh. Enosh is another Hebrew word that means man. Then men began to call upon the name of the Lord. And so advocates, proponents of this first view will say, see, this is clear instance that this is a godly lineage because men begin to call upon the name of the Lord during this time. Well, that in and of itself is not clear-cut evidence, is it? I don't think so. Again, there is a lot to say. There's a lot of promise coming out of Seth, but it's just not made clear enough for me that that's what's going on in Genesis chapter 6. I'm not quite sure why, if that is the meaning of this, that this is the meaning, that that's the meaning of what transpires, that the author of Genesis wouldn't have just told us that descendants of Seth, descendants of Cain intermarry. Why is it that we are introduced to these new terms? Sons of God and female human beings, okay? All right, so the second view. Now, the second view is not, I can't see that it's a very popular view. Meredith Kline, I believe, is one. Meredith Kline is a pretty well-known Reformed biblical scholar, is with the Lord. He held this view, I believe, and defended it. But this is not one that you'll see a lot of. Some will obviously defend it, but this seems to be probably the one that has the fewest number of proponents. That, of course, is not to say that it could very well be true, even if not a lot of people believe it, right? Just wanted you to know that this one is not as popular as the other two, but it may well be true. This is what we might call the royal marriage view, the royal marriage view. Essentially, the sons of God are kings, divine kings. And in the ancient world, it would have been thought that a king was himself divine in many cases. So these are individuals who are thought to be in some way divine, according to this view. And they take many women into their harems, which leads to corruption and injustice. And once again, interesting view, but I'm just not quite sure that that's the clearest and most natural reading of this text, okay? In my opinion, that neither one of these, if I were to take one of those first two, I think the best one is obviously the first one. Again, I just can't quite understand how we can make that jump into thinking that these are kings whose sin is to take many wives, polygamy, and then that, of course, leads to justice and oppression. Obviously, polygamy is not God's ideal, and it can lead to very difficult things. We see that in the life of Abraham, for example, in the book of Genesis. But once again, it just doesn't seem like a very natural understanding of this text. But nonetheless, there are people who have defended this perspective. It is a view that is out there, okay? Now, any questions just about the meaning of these two? Have I explained these clearly enough? Anything unclear about this?
It's the first time I've ever heard the one about the children of Seth.
Yeah.
I have heard ones about, that basically the sons of God were regular men, but they were kind of like stronger men and did great feats. And I don't think you're quite done with your theories yet, so I'll let you finish that.
Yeah. Well, it is. Yeah, it is interesting, that view.
But I didn't seriously believe that because it doesn't, it's very explicit.
Right. So I'll just say this before we get to the third one about this second view. Proponents of this understanding will point to the fact that even in the Old Testament, and you can show this, there is an idea that is present of human kings being sons of God. So that is something in favor of this view. For example, in 2 Samuel chapter 7, we don't need to turn there, time is fleeting. But in 2 Samuel chapter 7, if you remember, God promises David that one of his descendants is going to sit the throne of Israel forever. It's one of the great messianic prophecies of the Old Testament. And you'll remember, he's speaking of Solomon, and of course Solomon being a type of the coming Messiah, and he says, I will be a father to him, he will be a son to me. Do you remember? Well, when we go to Psalm chapter 2, verse 7, this is a royal coronation psalm, it would seem. And God says, you are my son to this king. And obviously this psalm is ultimately fulfilled in Jesus Christ. Does anybody remember what the verse is? You are my son, today I have begotten you. So there was a sense in which the king of Jerusalem, the king of Judah, David's offspring, they were counted as sons of God. But again, that is only David's descendants that are classified that way. And by the way, the term sons of God, that term itself is not used. The language of paternity, father, son, that's present, but son of God, sons of God, that we find here in Genesis 6, that language is not used. That term is not used. More on that in just a second. So once again, is there an idea present in the Old Testament that a human king could be styled a child, a son of God? Yes, but it is only the line of David. And obviously the line of David is way down the road from where we are here in Genesis 6, okay? So we come now to the third view. We'll take just a couple of minutes. Let me introduce it to you, and then I will try to unpack it the next time we're together. So this is what I call the supernatural view. I started to write the correct view and just kind of do a ha-ha thing, but I didn't want to offend anybody, so it's a joke. It's a joke. Okay, anyway, so I think it's the correct view. You don't have to think it's the correct view. It's just the one that I think is the most persuasive, but we can call it the supernatural view. So this is the understanding, and again, it is very ancient, that the sons of God are supernatural beings, angels, who take human form in order to have relations or marry human women. okay, in order to marry human women. So again, very supernatural. That's why we call it this. That's why I styled it the supernatural view, that this is an angelic rebellion. And we're going to talk about this. Can angels appear in human form according to the Bible? Absolutely. Just read Genesis 18, for example, and Genesis 19. Can they appear as human? Yes. We're going to talk about that. But it would be, according to Genesis 6, according to 2 Peter, according to Jude, a rebellion that takes place. So obviously in Genesis 6, this is not just commented upon in kind of a neutral way, sort of, well, this thing happened over here and just FYI, I want to let you know. It's obviously linked to human wickedness, to human evil, and if the view that I'm going to defend is correct, once we get to 2 Peter, once we get to Jude, it is explicitly styled as an act of evil on the part of angels for which they were immediately judged by God by being sent into hell, okay? So the next time we're together in a few weeks, we will consider this expression, sons of God. The only time that you find this actual expression, sons of God, used elsewhere in the Old Testament, it is clearly in reference to angels. We'll talk about that later. And then again, we're going to go into the New Testament and see how 2 Peter and Jude help us to answer this question, okay? So those are the three perspectives. They're the dominant perspectives. I'm not aware of any other view out there as to what this text means. It seems like everyone who has addressed this has fallen into one of these three camps, okay? All right. Well, listen, I want to respect Jansen's time, so I'm 4 minutes over. So let's go ahead and pray, and then we'll... Yes, sir. That's a good question. I would argue probably not. But again, we may talk about that some more. Again, it's a good question. I'm just probably of the opinion that what God does to these angels gets everyone's attention because they transgress their proper abode in the language of the New Testament. So could it happen again? I think most likely no. Okay, but good question. Well, let me pray for us all. Father in heaven, thank you so much again for giving us this time tonight. Help us, I pray, that we might understand clearly and accurately what the Scriptures are teaching. I know that, Father, this is a controverted biblical passage, and yet, once again, it is there, and we need to try to understand it, to glean what it is trying to tell us about and why that's important. And so I pray that you'd help me and you'd help us all to understand. I think I have it, but I could very well be wrong, Father. One of these other views could most certainly be correct. And so we just submit ourselves humbly to you, and we understand that this isn't, of course, touching on the gospel. That much in Scripture is quite clear, quite evident. And that most definitely is not up for debate. And so, Lord, we have put our trust wholly and completely in your Son, the seed of the woman, who has crushed the head of the serpent. Father, thank you for bringing your promises to fulfillment. Thank you for leading us to the knowledge of the truth. And Father, may we faithfully